In this episode, we look at a protection strategy that often appears in payment environments because it can dramatically reduce exposure to sensitive card data when it is designed and operated correctly. Point-to-point encryption, P2PE, is a way of encrypting card data very early in the payment flow, usually at the point of interaction where the card is read, so that the data stays encrypted as it travels through networks and systems until it reaches a secure place where it can be decrypted. End-to-end encryption is a broader phrase that describes the same core idea of keeping data encrypted from the start of its journey to the end, so that intermediate systems never see the data in readable form. Beginners sometimes hear these terms and assume they are automatic shields that make everything safe. But the real story is that these deployments are only as strong as their design boundaries, key management, and operational discipline. Protecting P2PE and end-to-end encryption deployments means ensuring the encryption is applied at the correct point, ensuring decryption happens only in approved secure locations, and preventing bypass routes where clear text data appears. By the end, you should be able to explain what P2PE is trying to accomplish, why it can reduce risk when done correctly, and what kinds of operational failures can silently undo its benefits. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to ground this discussion is to think about where card data is most vulnerable in the payment journey. Card data is at its highest risk when it exists in clear text, meaning readable form, because clear text can be copied, logged, cached, or observed by systems that were never intended to handle it. Every system that touches clear text becomes part of the sensitive environment, which increases the number of controls you must implement and increases the number of places an attacker can target. P2PE and end-to-end encryption aim to shrink that problem by ensuring that from the earliest possible moment, the card data becomes encrypted and stays encrypted as it passes through intermediate systems. Beginners should notice that this does not eliminate the need for security. It changes where security must be strongest and where exposure is reduced. If encryption begins at the point of interaction, many internal systems can process transactions without ever seeing the card data in clear text, which can reduce the scope of sensitive handling and reduce the value of compromising those intermediate systems. The promise is powerful, but it depends on strict adherence to the intended flow, because one clear text bypass can reintroduce the very exposure the model was designed to remove. To understand P2PE, it helps to focus on the role of the point of interaction device, which is where card data is first captured. If encryption is truly applied at that point, then the device becomes a critical trust anchor because it must be secure enough to protect keys and to ensure that what it encrypts cannot be intercepted in clear text. Beginners should recognize that if an attacker can tamper with the device, insert a skimmer, or alter the software that handles the card read, they may capture clear text before encryption occurs, defeating the whole model. This is why protecting P2PE begins with physical and logical controls around those devices, including ensuring devices are authenticated, monitored, and protected from unauthorized changes. It also means ensuring devices are deployed and maintained according to strict procedures, because an unauthorized replacement device can create a hidden leak point. The broader lesson is that early encryption shifts the most critical security requirement to the earliest capture point, and everything downstream depends on that point being trustworthy. When learners keep that anchor in mind, P2PE becomes easier to reason about as a system rather than as a slogan. End-to-end encryption also depends on having a clear and defensible definition of where encryption starts and where it ends, because otherwise the phrase becomes vague. Beginners often assume end-to-end means encrypted somewhere at the start and decrypted somewhere at the end, but security depends on exactly which systems are included in the end and whether intermediate systems ever see clear text. A strong end-to-end design ensures that intermediate networks, application servers, logs, and storage layers never receive readable card data, and that only a controlled decryption environment has the ability to access the plaintext. This controlled decryption environment must itself be highly protected, because it holds the keys and the capability to unlock sensitive data. The key lesson is that end-to-end encryption is not only about transport security. It is about preserving confidentiality across the entire processing path, including internal hops that might otherwise be overlooked. If one internal component decrypts data for convenience, even briefly, the chain is broken and the exposure expands. Protecting the deployment, therefore, includes verifying that the chain truly remains unbroken under normal operations and under error conditions. Key management sits at the center of protecting P2PE and end-to-end encryption, because encryption that uses poorly protected keys is like a secure vault with a copied key hidden in many places. Keys must be generated, stored, used, rotated, and retired under strict governance, and high-value keys often require controls like dual control and separation of duties. Beginners should understand that in P2PE models, keys may be injected into devices or managed through secure provisioning processes, and the integrity of those processes matters as much as the encryption algorithm itself. If a key injection process is compromised, attackers could potentially decrypt captured data or impersonate devices. Protecting keys also means preventing key sprawl, where keys are copied into multiple systems just in case, creating many points of compromise. It also means ensuring that decryption keys are accessible only within approved environments and not to general administrators who do not need them. When key management is disciplined, encryption retains meaning across the life cycle. When key management is sloppy, encryption becomes a fragile appearance of protection. Another major protection requirement is preventing clear text exposure through side channels that beginners might not anticipate. Even if the primary transaction flow keeps data encrypted, clear text can appear in places like debug logs, error messages, memory dumps, analytics events, or temporary files created during troubleshooting. A common operational failure is enabling verbose logging during an incident and accidentally logging sensitive fields, which can create long-lived exposure because logs are centralized and retained. Another failure is allowing support staff to capture network traces or screen recordings that include card data, which can leak through help desk processes. Protecting P2PE or end-to-end deployment includes defining strict rules about what can be logged, what data can be captured during troubleshooting, and how sensitive data is masked or removed from operational tooling. Beginners should see that these side channels are not rare. They are normal ways systems and people observe and debug problems. A strong deployment anticipates them and designs controls so that even under stress, clear text does not casually spill into places where it was never intended to exist. Segmentation and access controls still matter in a P2PE environment, even though encryption reduces exposure, because attackers can target the components that manage encryption and decryption rather than targeting the intermediate systems. If the decryption environment is reachable from broad networks, or if its administrative interfaces are exposed, attackers may attempt to compromise it directly. Beginners should connect this to earlier ideas about hardened administrative pathways, because encryption does not protect you if an attacker can become an administrator and extract keys or change policies. A secure design isolates the most sensitive components, such as key management systems and decryption services, into tightly controlled zones. It also controls which systems are allowed to communicate with them and under what conditions, limiting the ability of an attacker to pivot into those areas from a compromised workstation or vendor connection. Monitoring these boundaries is also important because unusual access to key systems is often a high-severity signal. Protecting the encryption deployment, therefore, includes ensuring the supporting infrastructure is segmented and hardened, not just assuming the encryption itself is enough. Testing and validation are essential because P2PE and end-to-end encryption deployments can fail silently in ways that are hard to notice without deliberate checks. Beginners should understand that failures may happen through configuration drift, software updates, device replacements, or integration changes that accidentally alter how data is handled. If one component begins decrypting data earlier than intended, or if a new logging setting captures fields that were previously masked, the organization may not realize the exposure has expanded until an audit or a breach investigation. Protecting these deployments means validating that data remains encrypted across all intended segments and verifying where decryption occurs. It also means validating that devices are correctly enrolled, that keys are correctly managed, and that any exceptions are documented and controlled. The discipline here is similar to segmentation validation, where you prove boundaries hold, except the boundary in this case is the encryption chain. Rigorous validation turns an encryption claim into evidence that the deployment behaves as designed. Operational governance is especially important because P2PE deployments often involve multiple parties, such as device vendors, service providers, and internal teams, which can create confusion about responsibilities. Beginners should notice that if nobody clearly owns the encryption program, gaps appear in maintenance, monitoring, and incident response. Governance defines who manages device inventories, who handles key lifecycle actions, who approves changes, and who responds when a device is suspected of tampering. It also defines training and procedures for people who handle devices, because physical security at the point of interaction is part of protecting encryption. Another governance aspect is change management, because changes to payment applications, network paths, and device firmware can affect how encryption is applied and where data flows. Without disciplined change control, teams may introduce clear text exposure unintentionally while trying to fix performance or usability issues. Strong governance keeps the encryption deployment aligned with its intended design and prevents slow drift that erodes protections. Incident response in a P2PE or end-to-end encryption environment also has special considerations, because the questions you ask during an incident are different when clear text exposure is supposed to be minimized. If an attacker compromises an intermediate system that never sees clear text, the immediate data exposure risk may be lower, but the attacker may still be able to disrupt operations, manipulate transactions, or seek a path to key systems. Beginners should understand that incident response must focus on whether the encryption boundary was maintained, whether devices were tampered with, and whether key systems were accessed or altered. That means logs and monitoring for device integrity, key system access, and unusual decryption events become especially valuable. It also means having procedures to quarantine suspect devices, verify device authenticity, and rotate keys if compromise is suspected. Revocation and replacement capabilities become part of protecting the encryption program, because you need the ability to stop trusting certain devices or keys rapidly. When incident response is prepared, the encryption deployment remains resilient even when attackers test its edges. A frequent misconception is that using P2PE automatically removes all compliance and security obligations, but in reality it shifts and reduces certain exposures while still requiring disciplined controls. Encryption reduces the number of systems that handle clear text card data, which can reduce scope and risk, but it does not remove the need for secure development, hardened access control, monitoring, or good operational discipline. Another misconception is that end-to-end encryption means the same thing in every environment, when the actual meaning depends on precisely where encryption begins, where it ends, and what systems are included in the trust boundary. Beginners should also be cautious about assuming that encrypted means safe, because if keys are mishandled or if clear text appears in logs, the protection can be undermined. The right mindset is to treat encryption as a design promise that must be verified continuously, not as a permanent badge of safety. When learners understand these misconceptions, they are less likely to accept vague claims and more likely to ask the right questions about where data is exposed and how keys are governed. As we close, remember that protecting P2PE and end-to-end encryption deployments is about preserving an unbroken chain of confidentiality from the earliest capture point to the final authorized decryption point. The chain begins at the point of interaction device, which must be physically and logically protected because it is the place where clear text could otherwise be captured. The chain depends on disciplined key management, including strong provisioning, strict access control, and lifecycle governance, so keys are not leaked, misused, or left unchanged forever. The chain also depends on preventing side-channel exposure through logs, debugging processes, and operational tools, because clear text leaks often occur through ordinary troubleshooting habits. Segmentation, hardened administration, monitoring, and rigorous validation ensure that supporting systems and decryption environments remain protected and that the encryption boundary remains real as systems evolve. When governance assigns clear responsibility and incident response is prepared to handle device tampering or key compromise, P2PE becomes a meaningful risk reducer rather than a fragile claim. In payment environments, that disciplined protection can significantly shrink the attack surface and reduce the damage an attacker can do, but only when the encryption lifecycle is operated with the same seriousness as the encryption math itself.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.